Okay, cool. So, hey everyone, thanks for joining tonight. Just to start off with, here's the NPE reading list that you'll find on the ARPA website. This is just a little spreadsheet that I've made that has a bunch of hyperlinks to these resources as well as summaries for the resources, which you can find in the tab down the bottom. And this is all free to access. I've just provided a link there in the group chat. So yeah, for those who don't know me, my name's Dylan Nichols. I'm a clinical psychologist and tutor. I started getting into this sort of NPE study group space at the start of last year when I made this spreadsheet and shared it around on Facebook, and people seemed to find it useful. And then I created the Facebook group that I think most of you are on, and then shared a few more resources and have started to run study groups since then. So this study group tonight is going to be on the 6 main tests of the assessment curriculum in the NPE. Now, how many people in the group tonight? You can just send through a thumbs up in the chat, or you can wait. What I might do actually, how many are? So, how many in the group are prepping for the November NPE that's about to come up? If you can just put a thumbs up on that little message that I sent through the chat. Okay, yeah. Okay, cool. So it seems like probably at least half of the people tonight, if not most. Okay, cool. So this will be pretty useful, I think. And for other people who are planning to do the NPE a bit later on, this will give you a bit of an overview of these tests and some of the main things that you need to know about. Okay. So I just know, I think someone's mic's on. Sorry, I'll just see if I can find.
اینجا داشته باشم همه چیزهای دیگر به دست میاد پیتزا که کمترین میشه.
There we go. That's off now. Sorry about that. Yeah, okay, so yeah, so these are going to be the 6 main tests of the NPE, which, as you all know, the PAI, the WISC, the WACE, the K10, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, and the DAS. Now, this group tonight is a free group on the 6 assessments. I also run these other study groups called the NPE Practice Question Discussion Groups. So they're probably more suitable for people who are just about to do their NPE in the next round or the round after. And those groups start up on September 24th, Tuesday. And it says there that it's $250 for the 5 groups, but if you've joined this group tonight, I can give you a discount. So if you'd like to join that group, you can just send an email to me. I'll just put my email in the chat. I'm pretty sure most people already have it, but just in case you don't, that's my email. So if you're interested in joining that, I can give you a discount of $50 and it'll be 200 instead of 250. Okay, cool. Now, with the assessment domain of the NPE, you've probably seen like on the curriculum, there's a lot of different points that it covers. And unfortunately, with the group tonight, because we're only just covering the 6 tests, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So anything that you see in grey on these slides won't be covered in the group tonight. So we don't do interview techniques or self-monitoring, goal setting, stuff like that. It's purely just going to be based on those 6 main tests. And as you can see here, there are a few other tests to know about for the NPE curriculum as well, which I've listed in this table below. Those tests aren't as important to know as the 6 main tests. Just having sort of a basic sort of idea of what each of those are and what they measure would be sufficient. Now, I'll just skip through these. So we're not going to go into, different conditions. That's another part of the NPE curriculum. So this group is going to cover um, these six tests. So the PAI, the WACE, the WISC, SDQ, K10, and DAS. Now I put DAS 21 there, but just ignore that. It's going to be about the DAS, both the 42 version and the 21 version. The 42 version was the one that was the original DAS, and then they shortened it with the 21. Now, in terms of the time frame tonight, I'll cover the PAI for around, 35 minutes. The WACE and WISC, I'll try and get that done in 40 minutes. Cover the DAS, the K10, the SDQ in the last half of the study group. So I've got on here that we're scheduled to start that at 6:15. So we've got 5 spare minutes. If anyone had any questions about the group tonight, yeah, this would be a good time, because after this, I'll probably go into it a bit quicker and get through a lot of content pretty quickly.
Dylan, you said you're recording this. Are we able
Mhm.
to have a copy of the recording?
Yes, for sure. So with the recording, the best way to go there is um, if you can send me an email at that same email address, and if possible, provide like a Gmail email address, a Google email address, because the recording will be a YouTube private YouTube link. They tend to work better with Google email addresses. So dylan.nicholspsychology@gmail.com. So anything that has gmail.com at the end of it tend to be good. And yeah, I can provide access to the slides as well.
Awesome, thank you.
It's all good.
Dylan, could I just
Yeah.
ask, you're about to run some groups if you want to sit November for people that are going to sit more around February next year. When will the next ones be held after that? Just knowing whether to start now or have it fresh in your mind beforehand.
Yeah, for sure. So for those who are sitting in February, I will have another practice question discussion group in the lead up to that one as well. That'll probably start around early January or late December. I think it might be early January that starts. But yeah, it'll be similar sort of format over 5 weeks in the lead up to that NPE exam. So yeah, if you can't make this one, like if you're not doing the November, if you're doing February and you just wanted to do it, for the one time, then it's best to do that in January as opposed to the November one.
Thank you.
And Katrina's asked a question there in the chat. What is the structure of your study group each week? So the structure of the practice question discussion group is basically for 2 hours each week on a Tuesday night. I think that's going to start around 7 o'clock. We just meet together as a group and we just meet together as a group. For 2 hours, we go through 16 multiple choice questions that are drawn from my reading of the NPE reading list. So from different areas of the NPE list, questions on communication, assessment, ethics, intervention. And as we go through those questions, I put it to the group and ask what answers the group came up with, and each person in the group puts their hand up and says, for example, I went with C because of this, and each person sort of provides their rationale. And then I reveal what the answer is, and then we have a bit of a discussion about why that's the correct answer. So yeah, I guess it's a good way to, practice getting used to multiple choice questions, but also learning about the content in each of those resources on the reading list. So yeah, I've been running those, I think, since midway through last year. And yeah, I recently ran the last one, I think was in July. So Rebecca's asking, is that weekly group capped in number of participants? Yeah, it tends to be around 30 maximum. So I don't like it to get too big because then, it becomes a bit more difficult to make it interactive and to give people a chance to, discuss their answers to the questions. So I like to keep it relatively small. A group like tonight's, a lot bigger than what those groups tend to be. So yeah, if you wanted to participate in that group, it's probably better off that I think it's 2 weeks away, so the 24th of September. So you've still got a little bit of time to sign up, but yeah, I want to try and limit it to a certain number. Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. Did anyone else have any questions before we start tonight? Okay, cool. So let's get into it. We're running on time. So the first one, wait a sec, I just need to get those slides back up. It just went off the screen there for a sec. Okay, so assessment study. Okay, so I'll share this. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. For some reason, it just stopped sharing, but we should be right now. Okay, cool. Now, the big six, for anyone who's watched Power Rangers, I've given a Power Ranger, for each test in the NPE curriculum. You don't have to remember what colors each Power Ranger are. It was just a way for me to make this a bit less tedious when I was developing these slides. But the first thing we're going to cover is the personality assessment inventory, otherwise known as the PAI. So just to start off with some of the psychometric properties, the PAI. So this is a scale that has strong content and discriminant validity. It assesses breadth as well as the depth of constructs. So what that basically means is, say, for example, something like the depression clinical scale, which is known as DEP as the abbreviated term for it. It's broken down into, I'll get it up here, broken down into affective, cognitive, and physiological. So it's assessing the breadth of this particular construct. It's not just focusing on one aspect of it. And that's the case for a lot of those clinical scales. You'll see it broken down into a few different areas. And there's also depth of the construct too. So measuring measuring this construct in some detail. Now, the PAI, when it was developed, was validated using 5 samples: 1 clinical sample, 2 community samples, 2 college student samples. I guess the reason why that's important is when we get to interpretation of PAI profiles and scores, knowing whether to compare the results to a clinical population or a community population is important. Like all these tests that we go through tonight, the reliability is good. In terms of the standard scores and the PAI, it's based off the T-score distribution, where the mean value is 50 and the standard deviation is 10. So a bit of the format of it, it's for adults, 18 plus. It's a clinical assessment of psychopathology, 344 items. So it takes a fair while to get through compared to some of the other some of the other scales that we'll go through tonight, but for something like psychopathology, you're assessing a lot of different constructs. Now, it's written for a 4th grade reading level, so quite a lot of people can complete it. There are 22 non-overlapping scales, so 4 validity, 11 clinical, 5 treatment, 2 interpersonal. Now, that might seem like a lot to remember, but once you start to look at each of them, and I'll go through a way to memorize them a bit better too. So they're based on a 4-point Likert scale, from false, not at all true to very true. Now, these are all the scales. Don't worry too much about the supplemental indexes on the far right. We won't really go into those too much in this group. It's a bit more advanced to a level of detail I don't think you would need for the NPE. But these are the other scales. So we've got validity, clinical, treatment consideration, and interpersonal. Now, in terms of validity scales, we'll go through these in a bit more depth later on in the group. But basically, you've got 4. You've got inconsistency and infrequency. And they're more related to, assessing whether someone's responses are random, idiosyncratic, whether there's been an error in the way that they've completed the test. And then you've got negative impression management and positive impression management. So for negative impression management, this might be a test taker who wants to appear more negative than what they are. So they want their mental health issues to seem more severe than what they actually are, to the point of perhaps malingering. Whereas positive impression are people that are trying to give across like a really good, perception of themselves, like they're better than what they are. And, that might be relevant for someone applying for like a job, that they'd want to appear to be, better than they are. So these are the 11 clinical scales. There's a fair few there, but one way that we can remember it is by using this. It's a bit of an outdated sort of concept now. You see it more in like psychodynamic work and stuff like that in psychology, but it can be a helpful way to, I guess, chunk, a helpful mnemonic to remember, each of these scales. So if you think of psychopathology on like this neurotic, borderline psychotic spectrum, and then below there, you've got behavior impulse control. So what we might do is a bit of an exercise just to, and I'll just throw this to the group chat, just to get people to have a guess of where each of these scales might land. Now, if we were to go back to this slide, so does anyone want to take a guess for somatic complaints? Whereabouts on that particular spectrum do you think that would land? Would it be neurotic, borderline, or psychotic?
Neurotic?
Neurotic, yeah. Okay, got a fair few neurotics. Sorry. I'm not insinuating that we've got some neurotics in the group, but yeah, we've got a fair few responses that indicate neurotics. So cool. So you're on the right track there. Thanks, Don. Okay, awesome. Now, the next one, so anxiety, where do you reckon that would fit? Would that be neurotic, borderline, or psychotic? Yep, so that's also neurotic. What about something like schizophrenia? Where would the schizophrenia scale land? Yep, Jasmine said psychotic. That's right. Yep, awesome. Okay, so what about alcohol or drug problems, like either of those scales? Where would that fit? Behavior, yeah. Behavior, impulse control. So that's right. And what about something like antisocial features? Where would that go? Yep, we've got a couple of different examples there, either borderline or behavioral. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. That's a tricky one. Because there's definitely behavioral issues there, but also personality. It's also a personality disorder. There could be some stuff going on there too. Age, Don, not too sure what you meant by that, but what about something like mania? Where would mania fit on this spectrum? Yep, down the psychotic end. I mean, you got paranoia as well. It's down that end. Um, borderline features would be somewhere in the middle there. So these are all the scales, I guess, just around this diagram. There's 11 scales in total. So one way that you can remember those a bit better is to fit them into each of these categories. Now, they don't necessarily fit into these categories neat and perfect. Like there might be some here that you feel should be could be a bit overlapped in different categories, but just for the purposes of remembering them, we've got borderline there in the middle, antisocial, drug and alcohol down the bottom in behavioral impulse control, paranoia, mania, schizophrenia in the psychotic end, and then you've got anxiety-related disorders, anxiety, somatic, and depression on the neurotic end of the spectrum. So that can be a helpful way of just remembering those clinical scales. Now, I won't go into this in too much detail because it is, it's a bit wordy. But yeah, you'll get access to the slides, so you'll be able to go through this. And if you have access to the PAI textbook, it sort of goes through each of these subscales anyway. But you can see that there's, some breadth to each of those scales. Most of them have 3 subscales. The borderline features has 4. And then alcohol problems and drug problems, they don't have any subscales. So yeah, all up there's 30 there, but it's most important to just know the 11. Just knowing these will be enough. Okay, so treatment consideration scales. There's not too many to remember here. There's just aggression, suicidal ideation, stress, non-support, and treatment rejection. Now, I guess the reason they call them treatment consideration scales, I guess it's implied in the term. These are just scales that are good to know about where someone scores on these particular scales when you're seeing someone for treatment. For example, if you're seeing someone who scores high in aggression, that can have an impact on the way you work with that person. Suicidal ideation, how high they score in that. It's going to have an effect on the treatment too, whether you're seeing someone in crisis. Stress, the level of stress they're currently going through, perceived lack of social support. And then the last one, their treatment rejection. So if you're seeing someone who isn't that motivated for treatment for whatever reason, they'll score high on something like that. So getting some questions there in the group chat. So Jasmine said, just clarifying, there are 22 scales and 30 subscales. Yeah, so good question. So what have we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Yeah, so you're right. So I guess in this case, you've got 11 scales, 11 clinical scales. And then, if we're just counting the subscales plus these 2 scales, you would have 30 all up. So is it likely we need to know the abbreviations for all the scales in the PAI? I mean, in terms of all the scales for the PAI, you would have to just knowing the abbreviation for the 11 clinical scales. And a lot of these are pretty straightforward because the way that they're written indicates what the abbreviation would be. For example, somatic, SOM, depression, DEP, paranoia, PAR, mania, MAN. So it can be quite easy to remember what the abbreviation is to the word. I don't think it's necessary to know the subscale abbreviations for all those subscales because there's just too many. I think just knowing the clinical scales, knowing what the 4 validity scales are, and the treatment consideration scales, there's a few to remember here, and then just knowing the interpersonal scales. Now, in terms of interpretation, it's good to know those abbreviations because once you get to interpretation, you might not see it that well in this graph, but if I was to zoom in a bit, you can see at the bottom here the abbreviations for each of these scales. So on the far left, you've got the validity scales, ICN, INF, NIM, PIM, and then you've got the clinical scales there. So yeah, I think it's important to know what those abbreviations are. And in total, what's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So all up there's what, 11 plus 4, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So 22 to remember there. 4 for validity, 11 for clinical. You got 5 there for treatment consideration, and then 2 for the interpersonal scales. Okay, now I'll just get back to presentation again. Okay, cool. Now interpersonal scales, it's only 2 to remember here. This is pretty straightforward. Just knowing dominance and warmth. So that little diagram at the bottom there can be, good to use to work out how this might influence, a person's interpersonal style. So, if there's someone who is high in dominance, like they want to take control of the conversation, they're really assertive, then, that might look different depending on whether there's also high warmth or low warmth. Someone with low warmth, you can expect they're going to be a bit more hostile. Someone with high warmth, they're going to be a bit more assertive and respectful of the other person's needs, but also their own needs. And then if they're low in dominance, they might be a bit passive, act a bit more helpless. And yeah, so having a look at that diagram give you a bit of an idea of person interpersonal style and how those, I guess, combinations can influence each other. So administration, like all these tests, establishing reports important, consent, all that sort of stuff. Assessing the suitability for administration. You can either do an electronic version or a paper and pencil version. That's just a bit of a picture there of, what the response sheet looks like. And then you've got the answer sheet there as well. Now, in terms of scoring, there's hand scoring options that you can do. You get a few profile forms there to work with. And then you've got the electronic version, which pretty much does it all just automatically. So out of everything to do with the PAI, this is probably the most important bit to know. If you know this and I guess, what each of the scales are for, then that's pretty much all you really need to know for the PAI. While I say that, at the same time, I also recognize that, that's still quite a lot of information to know, but it does become a bit easier when you know what the interpretation looks like. So there's 4 steps to interpreting a PAI profile. Now, a profile, for those who haven't done a PAI before, the profile might look something like this. This graph, you've got a bunch of numbers on there. At the top there, you've got what looks like a skyline in a city somewhere. And you've got a bunch of different sort of reference lines there that we'll talk about. You've got T-scores on the y-axis going from like 20 up to 110. And you've got the 50 T-score, which is the mean, which you can see the black line there around here. Now, we'll go into that in a sec, but the first thing to know when you're doing PAI interpretation is assessing for potential profile distortion. So this is important because if you're dealing with someone who's intentionally trying to distort their results in some way, then the results aren't really going to be too valid. So you want to make sure that that person's responses are truly reflective of their actual experiences. And so the first thing you do there is you want to have a look at, how do they score in terms of those validity scales? So the infrequency scale and the inconsistency scale, if that's elevated, that's more related to careless or idiosyncratic responding. So that's where the items might be answered randomly. A person might even have reading or language problems. There might be some errors in scoring on the part of the psychologist. So in that case, if those are really elevated, those validity scales, you can't actually interpret the profile because it's all going to be out of whack. So there's no point doing that. So you want to make sure that, you want to make sure that assessing whether the person's suitable to take the particular test to begin with, if there are any reading problems or language problems, being able to see that before you administer a test like this. And, being careful if you are doing the paper and pencil scoring that you're doing it carefully. So Katrina, what is the cutoff of them being too elevated? Yep, so we'll get to that. We'll get to that shortly, but basically, if we think of it in terms of like the T distribution, for the PAI, you've got a T score of 50, which is the means. So 50T is the mean, standard deviation is 10. So a helpful number to remember is if there's anything that's 2 standard deviations above the mean, which in this case would be 70T, then you're starting to get into that sort of elevated range. So if scores are starting to get into that range and above, then you're into territory there where it's starting to become too elevated. And yeah, in that case, you wouldn't be able to interpret for the careless or idiosyncratic type of distortion. So that applies more for infrequency and inconsistency. Now, it's a bit of a different story when it comes to negative profile distortion and positive profile distortion. So negative profile distortion, you can get an indication of that by looking at the negative impression management score. Whereas for positive profile, it's looking at the positive impression management score. Now, you'll notice on this table in the relevant scales, there's also the malingering index and the Rogers discriminant function index for the negative profile distortion. And then for positive profile, you've got the defensive index and the Cashel discriminant function. So these supplemental indexes, you don't really need to know them. That's a bit too, advanced, but that can just give you a bit more information in deciding whether, if someone does score high on negative impression management, is it because they were doing that on purpose? Like, were they trying to make themselves seem more, their mental health seem more severe than what it is? Or was it something that they actually weren't intending to do and it might be more covert? So by looking at some of those other indexes, it can give you a bit more detail there, whether the attempt to do it negative or positive was explicit or implicit. But that's not something you really need to know about. It's just knowing that, if these scores are elevated as well for negative impression management and positive impression management, you just want to exercise caution when interpreting that profile. So yeah, it could still be interpreted, but just, being able to note that, that the results might be skewed in a particular way, whether that's negative or positive. Whereas with a careless idiosyncratic, you can't give like a proper skew of like whether it's positive or negative. It's just completely random. And so it can't be interpreted in that case. What would make the profile? So Mohammed has asked, what would make the profile completely invalid? So that would be if you have these elevations on the infrequency or inconsistency indexes. So when they're elevated, that's when you're looking at a profile that's invalid. I mean, in this case, for negative and positive impression management, if those are elevated, like you can see that someone could potentially be malingering. And in that case, you're interpreting that profile with that in mind. So you'd make a note of that even though they've got these scores, it seems the negative impression management score was pretty high. So there's a good chance that, this profile is, the scores are a bit more negative than what that person's, true experience is. So that's the first step to do. The second step is working out, okay, with the profile that we've got, do we compare it to a clinical population of scores, or do we compare it to a community population? So which reference group do we need to use? Okay, Abdul has asked in the question, is there a point where you would need to scrap it as entirely invalid? Can they then be asked to take it again? Yeah, I guess that would be a case by case thing. Like there might be a good reason for why it was random. Like it could be the psychologist has scored it, hasn't scored it right. There might be some neurological issue or reading or language issue with the person where it doesn't matter how many times you give it to them, that they're still going to have an invalid score. So it's important to know, what the cause is of that. And if that can be, changed. If they're just having a bad day and they're doing it on purpose just to be manipulative and they're open to doing it properly at some time down the track, then, that's something that you would consider if you wanted to give it to them again. But yeah, it would be a case by case. It's important to know some of the pro forma questions and what scale they are assessing for. Did you want to add a bit of detail there, Jasmine, on what you mean by the pro forma questions?
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, the actual questionnaire that the clients use, would we have to kind of have an idea of what scale they go on to? Does that make sense?
Sorry, not really. What did you mean by that? Do you mean you're monitoring which question they're doing at each point, or?
Oh, just in terms of what subject. So each question obviously is assessing for something on a different scale. Do we have to have an idea of what questions are assessing
Okay.
for what?
No.
No,
That's
okay. That's a
that'd be
bit
a lot.
detailed, hey?
Yeah, for sure. That'd be a
Okay,
lot of
thanks.
detail because I think there's like 344 questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you probably wouldn't need to know that. But then again, like once you know each of those scales, if you did look at a question, you'd probably be able to work out, what scale that could be tapping into. But that's not something that you need to know for the exam,
Okay.
or I don't think you would have to know that even just practicing either. But there are a few questions which I'll get to in a sec. A few items in the scale that you do look at for interpretation. They're called the critical items. So there's 27 of them. So this is a lot of detail. You don't necessarily need to know this for the exam, but just if you're administering a PAI to someone, for example, when you're scoring it and interpreting it, you'd go back and have a look at these critical items to see where they score on them. Because, if they score high, for example, on substance abuse, then that might be something worth looking into. So these are more specific items that, might have something to do with potential risk that the client poses, where it's risk of psychosis with delusions and hallucinations, whether there's any self-harm risk, potential malingering, a few different things like that. But yeah, you don't have to actually know what exact items those are, but I guess that's, if you did have to know about any particular items in the PAI, out of the 344, it would be those 27 that would be most important.
Okay, thank you.
That's all good. Now, yeah, so after we've determined whether the profile is valid or if it's profile negative, if it's positive or negative profile distortion, the next thing you want to do is, do we compare it to a clinical population or a community population? So to know what to do there, you need to have a look at the profile and see if there's any scale that's above, sorry, any scale that's above this line here. So use the clinical population as the reference comparison, and that's when you would compare it to the clinical skyline. So if any of them are above this orange line here, so anything above, you got the green zone, you got the yellow zone, anything in the red zone, there's any clinical scale in that zone, then you would use the clinical population as the reference comparison. If all the clinical scales were below that line, either in the yellow zone or the green zone there, you would just use the community population as the reference comparison. And you can see with the clinical population, it has 2 standard deviations above the mean for the clinical population is represented by this skyline. So does everyone know what I mean by the skyline? This line that's above the 70 here for the most part, that sort of looks like a city skyline with skyscrapers. If you don't know what I mean by that, you can just let us know in the chat and I can explain it a bit better. But that's only important if you're using the clinical population as a reference comparison group. So yeah, that second step's just all about, you know, do you compare it to the clinical population or the community population? Now, if any of the 11 clinical scales are above 70 T, so they're above this orange line here, represented by this red zone, then you would use the clinical population. Also with the aggression and the suicidal treatment consideration scales, if those are above 70 as well, you would use the clinical population. So interpreting individual scales. So the most important numbers to remember here are the mean of 50, so 50 T, standard deviation of 10. And if we go 2 standard deviations above the mean, that'll give us the community reference line, which is this orange line that's running through at 70 T. So if scores are above this line, then they're in the clinic, you know, they're clinically significant. Now, when interpreting, you want to focus on scales with scores of more than 70. So these scores down here that are more in the average range, you know, aren't really that important. If you're focusing on interpreting individual scales, you want to just focus on the ones that are more in that clinical range. So that red line represents the community reference line. Now, interpreting individual scales, item level interpretation can also be useful. I mean, you don't want to get too bogged down in that, but if there's anything, you know, that's important, like with the critical items, you can have a look at that further. Now, so going through the 3 steps so far, we've looked at profile distortion, you know, checking the validity of the scale, the profile, which reference group you want to compare to, and then you interpret the individual scales, see where they fit on that profile. And then you want to look at profile configurations. So what that basically, well, there's a few different ways you can do it. There's either the 2-point codes, the mean profiles, modal cluster profile, actuarial rules. So a lot of these are a bit too detailed. You wouldn't need to know, you know, most of this stuff for the exam, like this level of detail, the profile configurations. But just for your own sort of knowledge, what tends to happen is when you get, you score a PAI and you see what are the two, you know, the 2 highest clinical scales. Often, you know, say for example, something like alcohol and drugs. If someone is elevated in alcohol, if that's their highest score, then more often than not, you know, drug problems might be their second highest score or vice versa in 9% of the population. So these are just examples of clinical scales that often score high together. Now, these modal cluster profiles are basically just looking at whatever the 2 highest clinical scales are and to see what that gives you. For example, with depression and anxiety, there's a cluster there, cluster number 7, that gives you depression, anxiety, agitation. A lot of this stuff you don't really have to know for the exam. I mean, step 4, I don't think it's too important. It's just a bit too detailed. I think just knowing what you're getting when you're looking at a profile like this. So being able to understand, what does this profile mean? What does the 70 T-score mean? Knowing that 50 is the mean. You've got the clinical skyline for the clinical population. And then down the bottom, you've got these, each of the scales, validity scales. To do an example really quickly. So let's say, for example, mania, which is a scale here. If for this particular person, if we were to look at what score they had for mania, it's around 30. So 30 is below 50, so it's not it's nowhere near the clinical range. Sorry, wait a sec. That number there is the actual score on the scale, but then if you can compare it to the T-score, so that 30 would be actually a T-score of around 60, 67, I think it is, or 68. So that's actually getting close to the clinical range. But it's not over that line yet, so you don't have to, worry about it too much. Whereas this one here, you can see that this is actually above 70. So this is what, about 77, 78 T-score. So that scale there is borderline features. Now, borderline features in this case is above 70 T. And you can also see with the suicidal treatment consideration, because, often with borderline personality disorder, they might have, issues with suicidal ideation or self-harm. And this one here is quite high. So what's that? Close to 100 T-score. So that seems to, that sort of configuration might be quite common in this particular presentation. You've also got a couple of other scales that are above the 70 as well. Aggression is above 70. Antisocial features is above 70. But the rest of them are below 70. So Rebecca's asked a question here. Sorry, when looking at the skyline, what does it mean? Are they averages for the clinical population? So they're actually, if you think of 70 T as 2 standard deviations above the mean for the community population, the clinical skyline is 2 standard deviations above the mean for the clinical population. So it says here, clinical skyline, 2 standard deviations above the mean for the clinical standardization sample, so the clinical population, which basically means that 98% of clinical individuals score below this line. So if someone's scoring, close to the clinical skyline or above, they're in a very small percentage of the clinical population, which is indicating that that score is actually really elevated. So in this case, the person's suicidal score is, close to the top of the clinical skyline there. So that's indicating that, they're around the top 2% of elevated scores on that particular scale. So yeah, I'll give you access to these slides so you can have a bit more of a look, at these profiles, and you can sort of have a bit of a go at, looking at each of these scales and where the scores fit. You can also do something similar for the validity scales. You can see in this case, the positive impression management is quite low, a T-score, around 38. So that sort of might give you a bit of an idea that this person doesn't really think too highly of themselves if that's quite low. The negative impression management is getting elevated. It's not at that 70 T yet, but it is above the mean. So yeah, there's a lot of time you can spend on looking at each of those scales. I guess the most important thing is just focusing on the scales that are above the 70 T and working out which are the 2 highest. So going back to the slides, there's an example write-up if you follow this link of a PAI report that this particular website, parinc.com, which has a lot of useful resources on the PAI on the website. You can also do online scoring on that website. And there's different applications of the PAI. It can be helpful for therapy, can be used in forensic uses. There's some strengths, it's helpful, in looking at psychopathology and giving you a bit of an indication of, what their diagnostic, what their condition might be in terms of their mental health conditions. It has the validity aspect to it with the validity scales. You can use different reference groups to compare scores to. And here are some of the limitations as well that you can have a look at when you go through the slides. I guess it's quite long to use. It takes time. And so if you're working in settings where you need to get things done pretty quickly, then you might have to look at using something else. Yeah. So for more information, you can follow that website link there, Pari Connect. That has a lot of good stuff. Parinc.com. You can check out free training there for the PAI. Okay, so moving on to the WACE and the WISC. Sorry if any of this stuff that I'll go through tonight, sorry if I go through it too quick. It can be a bit tricky to, cover everything in 2 hours. But yeah, if you wanted to focus on things in a bit more detail, you can always go back and look at the slides, or even just rewatch the recording if there's anything that didn't make sense. But in saying that, definitely still ask questions in the group chat. If anything comes up that doesn't make sense. Now, here are the 3, main intelligence scales. You've also got the WASI, which is not here, the Wechsler abbreviated scale of intelligence. Now, Abdul in the chat has asked, where can we access the slides? So I'll provide a link to the slides after the session tonight. So everyone who's attended tonight, I can just send an email out where you can get access to these slides. So looking at these 3 scales, so looking at the WIPSI, the WISC, and the WACE, you can see that there's different age ranges for each of these tests, right? So for the WIPSI, 2 years and 6 months up until 7 years and 7 months. The WISC, 6 years to 16 years and 11 months. And then the WACE is 16 to 9 and 11 months. So you can see here that the WISC and the WACE has an overlap. Now we'll just focus on these 2 because the WIPSI, I guess, isn't as important. So we'll just focus on these top 2. So there's actually an overlap in age range between the WISC here and the WACE. So you might find yourself in a situation where, what scale do you use? If you've got someone who's, 16 years and 6 months, do you use the WACE or do you use the WISC? And one way to look at this is, actually, I might throw this to the group. So say, for example, if you've got someone who's 16 years old and they're average or below average intelligence, you sort of get a bit of an idea they're either average or below average. Would you use the WISC or would you use the WACE? Okay, so we've got a few answers there in the chat. WISC. Yep, so you're all onto it. That's good. You would use the WISC in that situation. Now, I guess knowing the answer to that, you'll know the answer to the next question. If they're above average intelligence and they're 16, you'll go with the WACE. So similar principle applies with the WIPSI. So if a person's 6 years old and at least average intelligence, so they're at least average and above, would you use the WIPSI or the WISC? The WISC again, yeah, for sure. So here are the results here. You all got it right. So yeah, if you find yourself in a situation where there's an overlap between 2 tests, then just using these principles will help you choose which one to use. Now, waste reliability and validity. I mean, you don't need to know all these, coefficients and decimal point, these 0.90 for processing speed index on the waste fourth edition. I think just knowing that, they're good tests, they're well established, the main sort of intelligence tests you use when you're testing someone's cognitive abilities, and I guess that's why it's one of the 6 main tests that we're going through tonight. I guess one thing there that's probably important to remember though is that the WACE fourth edition doesn't have norms for Australian New Zealand population, whereas it does for the WISC fifth edition. I think the WACE fifth edition, when that comes out, it will have norms for Australia and New Zealand. That's something to just be aware of. Now, both of these tests have similar uses, developed for similar purposes to identify intellectual disabilities, assess for specific learning disorder in conjunction with using something like the Wyatt, the academic achievement test. Now, also evaluating, the strengths, weaknesses, assessing for giftedness, assessing neurological, whether it's brain injuries, being able to make educational, vocational decisions, or just obtaining clinical information for research and assessment. Now, similarly to the PAI, it's important to build rapport. There can be, considerations to keep in mind when you're working with people, that might have specific needs. So there's a few little points there. I mean, that's probably a bit more detail than you really need to know. I guess the important thing there is, something like the non-verbal index can be a good global ability option if you're working with children and adolescents that might be deaf or hard of hearing. Now, how many people in the group have used a WISC or a WACE before with a client? Okay, cool. Yep, so a fair few people. Yep. And if you've just used one or the other, that's fine too. They're quite similar, with some differences which I'll go into, but overall the idea is the same. So if you've already done it, I mean, the best way to learn about the WISC and the WACE, is actually doing the test with clients and then going through and scoring the results and interpreting it, in the process of doing that with real humans. I guess with what I'll be going through here, a lot of it will sound pretty familiar. It's just a bit of an overview of some of the main steps that are involved. Now, I guess the first step is you administer the item, then you're calculating the raw score of that particular subtest. For example, you might do this similarities subtest and you're calculating the raw score of it. The next thing you do is you go to the scoring manual, you're converting those raw scores to the subtest scaled scores, and those scores can range anywhere between 1 and 19, with 10 being the mean score, a standard deviation of 3 being the standard deviation there. And you then sum the scaled scores, and I'll show you what that might look like. So you might have, the scoring sheet might look a bit like this. You put their raw scores in, you're adding up a lot of these totals. And say, for example, with block design and visual puzzles, you're combining those two to get 22, which is the sum of those scaled scores. So those scaled scores are being summed up to get each of these scores at the bottom. And so then you get those scores and you go to the scoring manual to turn those scores into what's called composite scores. Now, those composite scores have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. and they range from 40 to 160 for the FSIQ, and then there's some slight differences there for each of the indexes. And then you would want to find the percentile rank for those composite scores, and then working out the confidence interval. Do you use 95% or 90%? Now, this is what it might look like in the next stage where you're putting these scores down. In the far left column there, you've got the name of the scale. Then next to it, you've got the sum of scaled scores. They get converted to the composite score. And then you've got the percentile ranks. And in this case, the person used 95% confidence interval, and that gives you, how confident, 95% confident that this person's score is between 95 to 110. Now, these are the subtests in these tests. So you can see that the WACE and the WISC, they share similar subtests. Both have the similarities subtests, both have the vocabulary subtests. They both have the information subtest, albeit with the WACE, it's a core subtest, whereas in the WISC, it's a secondary subtest. Comprehension, secondary for the WISC, supplementary for the WACE. So I won't spend too much time going through what each of the subtests are. Best place to probably go for that would be, I'll just put a link in the chat. Now there's this summary. So that's a summary of the WISC. And this here is a summary of the WACE. So if you look in there, you'll see, for example, I'll just see if I can get it up here. So if you're looking at the WISC, you can see that, you've got these subtests. The green subtests are these are the primary subtests. The ones in bold, there's 7, and they're used to calculate the FSIQ, the full scale quotient. So in the WISC, you use 7 subtests to calculate the FSIQ. In the WACE, it is a bit different. You use 10 of the subtests, which you can find here. So you got 3 there, you got 2 there, 5, 8, and 2. So this is what you would use to calculate the FSIQ for the WACE. So there are some similarities between each of these tests. They're both Wechsler intelligence tests. They've been through, a few iterations over the years. There's some differences, like for example, the arithmetic subtest in the WISC, it's a secondary subtest in fluid reasoning index, whereas in the WACE, it's in the working memory index. So that's one big difference there. And then picture concepts is a test that you only get in the WISC, whereas picture completion is a subtest you only get in the WACE. I think the most important things to remember, though, are the ones in green. So knowing about these ones, because they're primary subtests or core subtests. Those are the most important to know. And knowing which of those subtests make up the FSIQ. So you can see here that in the WISC, even though picture span is a primary subtest, it doesn't actually make up the FSIQ. So just knowing which ones make up the FSIQ, the ones in green. Okay, cool. So we've gone through, raw scores, calculating them, converting them to these subtest scores. You've got the subtest scaled scores, then you've got the summer scaled scores, the composite scores, percentile ranks, all that sort of stuff. Descriptors, we haven't touched on too much there, what that means, but we will in a sec. Now, moving on to interpretation. So this is probably both for the PAI and the whisk and the waste, I think the bit that can be a bit tricky to learn is, the steps of interpretation, but they are the most important things to know about, especially for the waste and the whisk. I'll go through step by step what steps you need to know about if you're interpreting the waste of the whisk, and then we'll just briefly talk about some of these things as well. Just making sure that I'm keeping on time. Okay, cool. Now, does anyone have any questions before we start with interpretation of the waste? Okay, cool. So we'll get right into it. Now, the first thing that you want to do once you get all these scores, you get the percentile ranks, you find everything out, you want to work out, okay, do we use the FSIQ or do we use the GAI as the measure of the overall intellectual ability? Like which one of those are we going to use to summarize this person's overall intellectual ability? Now, does anyone know what GAI stands for? You could just write it in the chat. So what does GAI mean? Yep. So it can be a bit confusing. I've made that mistake before too, getting it mixed up with global and general. You're looking at like an overall measure, I guess, a global measure of intelligence, but the correct term for it is a general ability index. So that's what GAI stands for, and FSIQ is the full scale intellectual quotient. Now, the first step here is you want to look at, okay, is the size of the difference between the highest and the lowest index less than 1.5 standard deviation? So I'll give an example in the chat. Let's say, for example, you've got a VCI score of 90, you've got a PRI score of 88, you've got a processing speed index score of 110, and you've got a working memory score of 85. So in this case, would you use the FSIQ or the GAI as the to summarize overall intellectual ability? So which one would you use? If you're looking at the highest the highest index, which in this case is the PSI, and the lowest index, which in this case is the working memory index, would you use GAI or FSIQ? So we've got a fair few GAIs in the chat, and you're right. And like Catherine said, it's because the difference is more than 1.5 standard deviation. Yeah, perfect. So in that case, we know we use the GAI. So is the size of the difference less than 1.5? No, it's not. It's actually more than that. So the FSIQ, you can't use it. It's not interpretable. So you go to step 1B. Now, the next thing you need to work out, okay, so if we're going to use the GAI, is the GAI itself interpretable? Is it a good measure of overall intellectual ability? So you want to look at the indexes that make up the GAI, which in the waste, it's the VCI and the PRI. So you're looking at these two indexes specifically, and you're trying to work out, okay, what's the difference between the two? Is it less than 1.5? Is it more than 1.5? So you're using that similar calculation. Now, in this case, if we were to look at PRI, which is 88, and VCI, which is 90, what are we looking at there? No. Yep. Okay, so is it less than... So in this case, the difference between the VCI and the PRI is 2. So that would be less than 1.5. So what that basically means is the GAI is interpretable. Yep, that's right. Kimberly and Rebecca said in the chat there, yep, so you can use it. So yes, it can be used. Now what we do is proceed to step 2. Now let's say, for example, you had a different situation where the VCI was, 120 and the PRI was 90, just hypothetically, you wouldn't be able to use the GAI in that situation because those indexes are way too different. And so in that case, you wouldn't be able to use FSIQ or the GAI. So a measure of global ability is not meaningfully conveyed as a single score. So you wouldn't be able to use the FSIQ or the GAI. You would just have to look at specific indexes. Okay. Now, after you've gotten through that first step, you go to the next step. And this is looking at just the indexes themselves. So these primary indexes, you got the PRI, you got the PCI, you've got PSI, you've got the working memory, you've got the VCI. So you want to look at, are these indexes within themselves, are they unitary? Are they, can you interpret them? So in this case, you're looking at whether the difference is less than 5 points. So for example, you might have something with the VCI. You might have, if we go back to the example here, this person, they're in terms of their verbal comprehension, their similarities was a score of 10, and their vocabulary was a score of 11. So in this case, it is less than 5 points, right? So VCI in this case can actually be interpreted. Whereas if the similarity score was 12 and the vocabulary was, say, something like 4, then in that case, because it's greater than 5 points, you wouldn't be able to interpret the verbal comprehension index. So if you can, great, you interpret it, you interpret each of those indexes, then you move on to step 3. If you can't, the difference is too great, then it's not cohesive and you can't interpret that particular index. The next step is to evaluate the index level discrepancy comparisons. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what that basically means is you're looking at whether the difference between the indexes is equal to or larger than the critical value in the scoring manual. So this is something that's a bit tricky to do it through the slides because I haven't got the actual scoring manual with me. But for those who have done a whisk or a race before, you would normally, look at the sheet and would go through, you'd find out, you're looking at differences between different indexes, and then you work out whether that difference between those two indexes is larger than that critical value that's in the scoring manual. And then, if the difference is a true difference, you go to the next step, which is judging how rare this difference is, which is called like a base rate. So the cutoff there is if it tends to be an unusual discrepancy when it's in less than 10% of the population. So hypothetically speaking, the difference between, the VCI and the PRI, you might have someone where that difference is like really, really great and really large, and that might be something that's really rare in the population. So, okay. Now these next steps, step 4 and 5, are similar but pretty different in a way too. Like one's more to do with comparing the person's results to the to norms. So, a person might score over 115 on the PRI, which is equivalent to 1 standard deviation above the mean. And that might be a strength for them compared to the population. So if it's 1 standard deviation above the mean, you know, it's a strength compared to the population. If it's 1 standard deviation below, it's a weakness compared to the population. And then you've got personal strengths and weaknesses. So that's basically looking at, you know, how does a person's like subtest scores, how do they compare to their their average performance overall? So, okay, so Jasmine's just asked in the chat there, just confirming if the difference between subtests on an index is not interpretable, this means the index is not valid. Therefore, would this affect the validity of the FSIQ? That's a really good question. So let's use an example there. So let's say the difference between the subtest is not interpretable. So if you're looking at a subtest, highest and lowest, so the VCI, you know, vocabulary was 4 and similarities was 12. And the VCI would be not interpretable in that case. And so that would be in step number 2, you're looking at that. And before that step, you might have worked out that FSIQ actually is interpretable in the first step. So you might work out FSIQ is interpretable in the first step because there isn't these like significant differences, you know, between each of these. And then you go to the second step and you realize that there's actually a significant difference between this particular index. That's a really good question, Jasmine. I don't know the answer, to be honest. I'm not too sure how often that would happen, but you'd imagine, you know, it's possible that it would happen. I don't know whether, you know, if step 1, you find out what the overall intellectual ability is, you know that that's for sure. There's a part of me that thinks, okay, well, after that, if you find that there's a discrepancy, does that actually impact the previous step? And I'm not too sure about that one. I'll have a look into it. Yeah, I don't think you would get a question that detailed. That's probably that'll be asking too much of people, I think, if they had a question like that. But I'll have a look into it and let you know what the answer there could be. Now, step 6 and 7. Yeah, subtest level comparison is not really that important. It's something you can do when you're going through that sort of scoring sheet. Step 7, I guess this is pretty, you know, straightforward, something that you would do anyway, like whenever you do any sort of test. You're generating hypotheses about what the results mean. And you're integrating those results with results from, you know, behavioral observations, collateral, the person's history, background information, and then determining whether you do any extra testing after that. Now, alternatives to the FSIQ, so GAI, we've talked about that. And here's just a couple of examples that you might use it in. Those with neurodevelopmental disorders tend to have difficulties with cognitive proficiency. So in that case, their GAI score tends to be higher than their CPI. Does anyone know what CPI stands for? Yep, Cognitive Proficiency Index. Now, nonverbal index for the WISC, we talked about this before, just in terms of using for those who might be hard of hearing or any sort of speech language impairment, people who are learning English, where English isn't their first language, stuff like that. Now, these are just a bit of a table here that summarizes how you calculate the GAI, the CPI, and the nonverbal index. Yeah. So you can have a look at that. For the waste, it's pretty straightforward. It's just the VCI plus the PRI for the GAI. And for CPI, it's working memory and processing speed. Now, subtest scaled scores. So, like I mentioned earlier, there's a particular range of these scores. The mean's 10, the standard deviation 3. Not that important to know about that. I think it's more so these indexes that are more important. So, in terms of these descriptors, you'll see that there's 7 descriptors. In the middle, you've got the average range for a score. And these are based off these like percentile ranks and the composite scores. So the bottom, you've got extremely low. So if a person's percentile rank for a particular score is less than 2, then they're in the extremely low range for that particular score on that index. You got very low, you got low average, average, high average, very high, and extremely high. I guess one way to think of this is just going back to first year statistics. You've got this box and whisker plot here at the bottom. Now, the interquartile range, Q1 to Q3, right? You could think of that in terms of the whisk and the waste if you're thinking about sort of interpreting these scores. The percentile rank from the 25th percentile to the 74th percentile is sort of like Q1, the first quartile there, that's representative of 25. Then you've got the third quartile, representative of 74. So in between there is where you would find, the average range of scores. And then below that, you have low average, very low, extremely low. And above that, you have high average, very high, extremely high. So that's one way you can sort of remember that. I guess going back to this, this is something that can be important to know for a lot of assessments. If you know what the mean score is, and you know what the standard deviation score is, you can get a fair idea of what the clinical range is going to be. So it tends to be 2 standard deviations above the mean, right? In this case, it's like above and below. Above would be more indicative of, someone who's gifted in a particular area. If 2 standard deviations below the mean, you're starting to get into that extremely low range where there might be something clinically going on there. For example, if someone's extremely low for verbal comprehension index, there might be some language speech issue there that you would do sort of further testing on. Working memory, if that was extremely low, there might be other tests that you would do there. There might be some specific learning issue. There might be some attention, concentration, executive functioning issue. So you're using these descriptors in these percentile ranks as ways to, the descriptors are important to use because when you're writing a report, often the people that you're writing the report for probably don't care too much about, what their composite score was or what their percentile rank was. They're probably looking at more of, is my score average? Is it the very high range? Is it extremely high? Using each of these descriptors so it sort of makes sense to the average person. Now, we won't spend too much time on this guess the descriptor game that I came up with. So I don't think it's really that important to, be able to look at a composite score and know exactly, what descriptor that indicates. But it's pretty straightforward knowing that, if you've got a composite score of 100, which is the mean, percentile rank is going to be 50. And so, in that case, that's going to be an average score. Whereas looking at something like 130, that's a pretty high score. That's a percentile rank of 98. So you're looking now at, the extremely high range. Now, the working memory index is 125, so that would be very high. It's not in the extremely high. Processing speed index, 109, so it's 73 percentile rank. So you're looking still in the average range for that one. Now, this can be a useful table to use just for a lot of different types of tests. I won't go into it now, but it just basically gives matches particular standard scores with percentile ranks, descriptors, all that sort of stuff. Now, I mean, this is a bit more detail. You don't really have to know it. I just included it here just to give you a bit of an idea of, a lot of these tests are based on research and particular theories. In this case here, you have this sort of G factor, this overall measure of intellectual ability, and then underneath it, you've got these sub-factors. For example, GF, fluid reasoning, which in the WISC, the fluid reasoning index. So yeah, it's just based on particular theories of intelligence and factor analysis. So yep, don't have to know this too much. It's more important when you actually have the manual in front of you and you're doing the test. But just knowing that, there's particular rules for where you start on certain subtests. Now this is related to, similar to what Sandeep was referring to there just before about supplementary tests. So with the WACE, you can substitute one supplemental subtest per index. You can only substitute a maximum of 2 subtests to retain the validity of the FSIQ. In the WISC, you can only substitute one secondary subtest for a primary subtest when you're calculating the FSIQ. So it's not as flexible there as the WACE is. I mean, if there's an example where you've already administered the test and you can see that there's this big difference between 2 subtests, you wouldn't then go and do a supplementary test in that case, because then you'd have to get the person back and, do that particular test again. But yeah, you can, if there's any sort of error in the, in the administration of the test or whatever happens there, you can sort of substitute some of these other tests. So now going on to the DAS. So we've got through the 3 biggest assessments, I guess, and then for the last half hour tonight, I'm just going to go through these 3 scales, the DAS, the K10, and the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. So these first 2, I guess, are more developed, to use with adults typically, and the SDQ is more of the children, adolescent, emotional, behavioral, scales. So firstly, we'll have a look at the DAS. Now, with the DAS, there's an example of the form there. That's for the 21 version. And you've got a 4-value response option. I'd imagine pretty much everyone in the group's probably used a DAS before. And you've got certain cutoffs from normal to extremely severe. Now, I was going to ask, does anyone know who that guy is? But I've put his name there. So I mean, if his name wasn't there, you probably still would know who this guy is. He developed cognitive therapy, and along with Albert Ellis, was involved in developing CBT. And he also developed these inventories, the Beck Depression Inventory and the Beck Anxiety Inventory. And he wanted to do that to, measure these negative affective states of depression and anxiety, because it's, I guess, important to be able to measure where someone fits in terms of their severity, because then you can track that over time, see how they're responding to treatment. But later research found that when you would look at a person's score on the BDI and the BAI, a lot of the time there was this moderate correlation there between the 2. So it's sort of hard to distinguish between, depression and anxiety. And in often cases, some, people might have a comorbidity there between depression and anxiety. So this led to the development of the DAS, because they wanted to, have a scale where they could, measure 3 negative affective states in the one scale. So depression, anxiety, and stress. It was developed by this father-son combo here, Sid Lovibond and Peter Lovibond. And yeah, they developed it, I think it was, so in the 90s there, early 90s. And so they wanted to discriminate between these negative affective states. And you can have a look in the DAS manual for more information there on how they chose certain items to include and scale development and stuff like that. And you can also access this article that talks a bit about what they did there too. Now, psychometric properties, it's quite reliable, it's valid. Even though they developed it in response to that moderate correlation between the BDI and BAI, they also found that in their own scale, depression had a moderate correlation with anxiety. And anxiety can have a moderate correlation with stress. So it seems to be something that's pretty hard to distinguish between, which might suggest that, there might be some factor that's above depression, anxiety, and stress, like something like neuroticism, emotional, someone's propensity to experience negative emotion. That could be, the overarching sort of factor that's related to these. The DAS-21 was developed a bit later on in the mid-2000s, just because the 42 items, I guess, was a bit too long to use. And yeah, so depression, anxiety, stress. There's a question in the chat. Abdul's just asking if anyone here has used the DAS-42 instead of the DAS-21. Yeah, I think, yeah, the 21 would definitely be a lot more common. I can't think of many situations where you want to use the 42 preferentially over the 21 because they have similar sort of reliability and validity. And I think that was part of the reason why they wanted to, these other authors wanted to develop the 21 because, they found that probably the 42 just took too long to administer. Now, with the DAS subscales and domains, so the depression, anxiety, and stress, each of these areas, each of these negative affective states, you've got particular, I guess what you would call it the factor structure of each of these subscales. So with depression, there's 7 domains, and these are the items that it sort of taps into. So some of these are pretty, it's implied in the wording of the question, which domain it would be. I feel downhearted and blue, dysphoria, nothing to look forward to. That's related to hopelessness, difficult to work up the initiative to do things, inertia. Anxiety, there's only 4 domains, and some of these items got multiple items mapping onto each domain. So with autonomic arousal, you've got a few questions here that map onto it. Got skeletal muscular effects, situational anxiety, subjective experience. Stress has got 5 domains. Difficulty relaxing, irritable, overreactive, nervous arousal, impatient, easily upset, agitated. Now, I'll put a question in the chat and just feel free to answer it if you want to. So if a person scores severe on stress and mild on anxiety, which of the following conditions is most likely? So I'll put a few options here in the chat and then people can answer this, see what they reckon. So that's the question. So people can have a crack at that. So if a person scores severe on stress and mild on anxiety, which of the following conditions is most likely? Okay, we've got a few options here that are all the same. Seems like people are saying generalized anxiety disorder. Okay, cool. So that's just a quick question I just sort of came up with just then. I haven't put too much thought into it, but the idea there is just reiterating that the stress subscale of the DAS tends to map onto generalized anxiety disorder. So if someone scores, pretty high on that, and they might be low on depression and low on anxiety, then it's more likely to have some stress-related issue or generalized anxiety disorder. You can look at some of these domains: difficulty relaxing, nervous arousal, irritable. These are some things that you would find more in GAD as opposed to other anxiety disorders like social anxiety disorder or panic disorder. I mean, something like panic disorder, you would probably see they would score really high on the anxiety subscale because it is more to do with, autonomic arousal, situational anxiety. I was worried about situations in which I might panic and make a fool of myself. Depression, that would be someone who might be severely depressed. Their depression subscale will be, pretty high. But they also might have pretty high stress as well, subscale. But it would mainly be that depression subscale that would be the highest. So looking into the DAS, you can't use it as a diagnostic tool. Like you don't want to sort of just base the results. You get a person's results on depression, anxiety, and stress, and then say, hey, this person has generalized anxiety, or this person has, major depression or anything like that. But it can point you in particular directions that you can then, do follow-up testing. You're doing an intake interview, history taking, a lot of that sort of stuff. Abdul's just mentioned, perhaps not important, but I'm wondering how they managed to differentiate anxiety and stress subscales. How do they manage to split autonomic arousal away from stress? Yeah, it's a good question. And like I said earlier, like with this table here, you can see intercorrelations between the DAS scales. And they find that DAS anxiety and DAS stress. So DAS anxiety and DAS stress are correlated 0.65. So, that's quite a high correlation there. So it's sort of suggesting that there is a little bit of overlap there between, these two subscales. But what they did is, with a lot of these particular assessments, they do factor analysis. If you look at the original paper for the DAS and how they developed it, it will give you an idea about how they, differentiated between those three. But you're right, there is a bit of overlap there, and it's hard to fully separate the two. So autonomic arousal, breathing difficulty, aware of the action, dryness of my mouth. You can see how those are, those typical sympathetic nervous system responses. Like when there's adrenaline running through your body, the sympathetic nervous system's active, you're experiencing those symptoms. Whereas something like, for example, stress, difficulty relaxing, irritability, nervous arousal, easily upset, agitated, impatient. Nervous arousal might be similar to autonomic arousal. But this type of, it's interesting because it's probably more related to fear, these symptoms, as opposed, this would be more related to anxiety. I guess a way of distinguishing between fear and anxiety: fear, is an immediate threat. I'm sure you all know this anyway, but, and then anxiety, worry is more of, a future threat that you're worried could potentially happen. And that tends to be related more to stress, the stress subscale. So making sense of the differing cutoffs for the DAS. Yeah, you don't really have to remember each of these numbers because it varies depending on the scale. But I just provided this diagram there to give you a bit of an idea of, how they got to each of these cutoffs. It was sort of based on the raw score, which, they looked at what percentile rank that mapped onto when they were looking at the particular population that they normed this scale with when it was developed. And those norms were for the DAS. So not the DAS 21, but for the DAS 42. Now, Kessler Psychological Distress Scale, so the K10. Now, 10 items. Scores range from 10 to 50, and you've got cutoffs there for that as well, depending on the use. If you're using it more for surveys, which was what it was originally developed for, because it wanted to, you know, more for epidemiological purposes, seeing the prevalence of mental health issues in the population. So more of a survey use. But it's also now become something that is used, for more clinical uses as well, and can give you an indication of how likely someone is to have a mild disorder, a moderate disorder, severe disorder. And so we'll have a look at that. Now, just another question there in the chat. Are norms updated? Do they need to be, especially for old tests? That's a really good question. From time to time, they'll have, updated norms. There might be, say, for example, a test might be developed in a particular country like the US, and, an Australian sample or a UK sample or any sort of country might want to update the norms so it's relevant for their particular population. And so they might do that if they think that's worthwhile. In other situations, they might even have to translate questionnaires to a different language, and, they might then update the norms as well. But yeah, the K10, going back to this. So like I said before, it was originally developed, to measure the prevalence of mental health, serious mental health and the mental illness in the population. It's pretty quick to administer. Anyone 10 years and above can use it, which is useful because with the DAS, someone that young can't use it. Although with the DAS, you have like a youth version now where younger people can use it. And yeah, so in Australia, it was first used in 1997. Now, if you break the K10 down into what it's actually tapping into, it tends to be depression and anxiety, sort of broadly speaking. And then within that, so within depression, you've got negative affect, you've got fatigue, and anxiety, you've got nervous and agitation. One question could be, if it's measuring similar, symptoms to the DAS, then why wouldn't you just use the DAS? Like, why would you use the K10 in this instance? Like, how do you know what test to select in a particular situation? And I think, knowing the answer to those questions is pretty important for the NPE, because you might have a question, that's related to, a person is presenting with this particular issue. What test would you give them to find out more information? And, you might have to make a choice between K10, DAS, um, outcome rating scale or whatever it is. I mean, the benefit of using the DAS is it gives you the 3 negative affective states: depression, anxiety, and stress. The benefit of the K10 is it's a lot quicker. It's good for surveys because it was sort of developed for that. So yeah, there's a few different factors there that might influence which one you use. Now, there are Australian norms for the K10 that came out from a research study in 2011. And I think that's one of the NPE resources on that spreadsheet. So they found out results from that. Psychological distress tends to be higher in women versus men, and people with a mental disorder versus those without, people with affective disorders versus those with substance use disorders. And yeah. So this is a little bit nerdy. You don't really need to know this, but this is just sort of based off that research study. Just as an example, the percentage likelihood that someone has a mental health disorder. They looked at 8,839 people in this particular sample, and they found that if someone scored between 30 and 50, it was nearly 80% chance that they would have a mental health disorder, whether that be affective disorder, like, like a mood or bipolar, anxiety disorder, or a substance use disorder. 80% chance if they scored from 30 to 50. If they scored from 10 to 15, which is pretty low, it would be a 10% chance, or close to 11% chance. So with a lot of this research that was going on, they, developed you know, things like this of how to interpret the K10. And it differs slightly depending on whether you use it for a survey versus whether you use it for clinical purposes. In clinical purposes, you're more concerned with what's the likelihood this person has a disorder, has a depression or anxiety disorder. Whereas in surveys, you know, you might be looking more about, you know, what's the range of their distress from little to no distress up to very high distress. And in both of these, you can see scores of 30 plus indicate very high or severe, you know, likely that the person has a severe disorder. Yep. So, you know, it's reliable, it's valid. You know, there's different types. You can have the K6, you have the K5. It's pretty quick to use. The K10 outperforms the K6 when screening for severe disorders. But the K6 can be useful to use because it's a lot quicker. But then again, 2 minutes for K10 is actually pretty quick. Like, how quick do you want these, you know, assessments to be? And then you got the K5, which is has been used in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations in nationwide surveys on health. Now, the last questionnaire for tonight is a strengths and difficulties questionnaire developed by Goodman. Now, I'll just write a question in the chat. I'm just going to say SDQ. And if you've used the SDQ, just give that a thumbs up if you can. Yep. I've got a couple there. All good. So if you do tend to work more with adults, you probably haven't used it, but this tends to be more common if you're working in school settings or you know, at a child youth mental health service or private practice where you see, you know, kids and adolescents. Now, that's just what it looks like. You got the front side and the back side. Now, what you're assessing in this case is you're detecting child and adolescent behavioral and emotional problems. Developed by Goodman in 1997. At that particular moment in time, you didn't really have too many brief measures of emotional behavioral problems. You'd have these big sort of tests like the CBCL, child behavior checklist, and I guess education was starting to move more towards like what are the students' strengths? Like, let's not just focus on the pathology, the difficulties that the person has. What might be some of their strengths be? And the SDQ came along because it sort of fit a lot of that criteria. So you have a single-sided form, which is just that form on the left, or you can have the double-sided form, which is both the left and the right. And doing the double-sided is helpful because you can find out a bit more specific information about how long the difficulties have been around for, which particular context the difficulties apply to. In total, there are 25 items, and there are 5 for each subscale. So on the back of the form, the double-sided form is what's called the impact supplement. So the subscales, you've got emotional symptoms, you've got conduct problems, hyperactivity, peer problems, and prosocial. So the way that the top 4 are worded as if they're difficulties, like they're a problem for this particular child, whether it's emotional issues, conduct problems, hyperactivity, peer problems, whereas prosocial, you know, seems to be more of like a strength. It's you know, how well this person is with other people. But the way some of these items can be worded, it can be worded in a positive way. For example, you might have an item like thinks things out before acting is one of the items. So thinks things out before acting, you would say, you know, that's more related to hyperactivity. But the way that item's worded, it's in the reverse direction. So someone who thinks things out before acting would be low in hyperactivity, whereas most of the items for those subscales are worded, you know, to measure the level of difficulty. So these top 4 subscales, you combine those scores to give you the total difficulty score, and that ranges from 0 to 40. Now, I've put a link in there to the SDQ website where you can have a look at, you know, each of these versions. You can download the forms if you want to use them with people. In terms of age range, you've got a form there for 2 to 4 years old, then you've got 4 to 10 years old, and then 11 to 17. I guess it sort of maps on a little bit to, you know, preschool, primary school, high school. Now, uses of the SDQ can be part of an initial assessment. You can't use it to diagnose a person's issues, but it's part of the assessment. You know, you can use it to evaluate outcomes, evaluate how a person's progressing. Can be used in research, epidemiological studies, screening for the presence of a disorder. You would then use sort of follow-up assessments to work out what's going on. Interpretation. So you don't really, like a lot of these, you don't have to remember the raw score cutoffs. And especially for the SDQ, they vary a lot depending on, you know, the gender, the age, who's doing the test, whether it's a parent, teacher, or the child. But it's important to remember these 3, I guess, descriptors. The first one is low difficulties. So if someone is scoring in the bottom 80% of the scores, then their difficulties don't tend to be too great. If they're in the medium range or borderline difficulties, they're starting to get closer to that clinical range. And then the higher abnormal of concern difficulties, they're the ones that you need to, you know, really follow up with, and they're more of reason for concern. There's Australian norms for them. Benefits, it's free, doesn't take long. There's an emphasis on strengths. There's Australian norms. It's reliable, it's valid. Limitations, you can't use it to diagnose problems. It's more of a screener. And the norms are based off one Australian state. So this is a bit of an overview of what we've been through tonight, just as like a reference. Can be good to sort of look at this as you're learning about each of these, because it sort of gives you an overview of, you know, what each test is about. You can see that the PAI is a measure of psychopathology. Measuring cognitive abilities is more of the WAIS and WISC. You've got these screening tools below here for negative affective states and behavioral problems. Different indexes and subscales that they assess. The administration time, you can see that the K10 is very quick. The DAS is pretty quick too, the SDQ. Age ranges, Australian norms for most. And then the scores, what scores do they use? T-scores for the PAI. You know, in the WAIS and WISC, you've got composite scores, you've got the subtest scaled scores. In the DAS and K10 and SDQ, you've got raw scores. There's different sort of descriptors there depending on how severe the score was. So that's pretty much it for the assessments. So we've gone through the 6 main assessments tonight. It's quite a bit of information there. You know, it's if you haven't sort of, you know, if all that hasn't gone into your brain just in one sitting, then that's okay. I don't think that would be possible because there's just so much information. And I'll give you all a copy of the slides so you can go through and have a bit more of a look at it, and you can, you know, look through the recording to, you know, go over it. And in case there's anything that you didn't understand or anything that you missed, and feel free to, you know, reach out to me as well if you have any questions about anything that we covered tonight or anything, you know, to do with the NPE. And yeah, so for those who are interested, the practice question discussion groups, I'll be starting them up again in a couple of weeks' time on the 24th of September. They'll go for 5 weeks. If you wanted to, get involved in that, if that's something you're interested in, I can send out a link to that if you want to sign up. I'll just put a link in the group chat there too. If that's something you'd be interested in, we'll go for 5 sessions, 2 hours each. And I've created a little private Facebook group as well for that one, where people who attend the group can sort of communicate with each other, share resources, connect with each other, share study tips, advice on how to prepare for the exam, stuff like that. And I'll post, resources on there as well. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for tonight. Does anyone have any questions after our study group tonight?
Mine was about the study groups, but you've already sent out a link. So thanks.
All good. Thanks, Angie. No, I cannot, unfortunately, Katrina. As much as I'd love to, unfortunately, I can't. Now, for the slides, I can just send out everyone that's been in the group tonight. I think I've got your email from signing up to the group. I can just send the slides to you all directly.